What a great panel. I've already introduced Emily Doolittle, who's from the Institute of Education Science, and Roger Weisberg from the University of Illinois, but neither has had a chance to talk yet, and we try to give everybody a chance to talk. So, go ahead.
Okay, I'll take it away. Well, first of all, I'm really excited to see all of you here, and I'm really proud of this particular issue. So in the work I do at the Institute of Education Sciences in our National Center for Education Research, I've really watched an amazing transformation over the past 9 years that I've been in this role. So I oversee a portfolio of work that looks from kindergarten through 12th grade. What are the right social skills, behaviors, and attitudes to have in place so that we have a positive environment for academic learning? And when I first started in this role in 2008, just a little bit of context here. So we support field-initiated research through the National Center for Education Research. So researchers out there come to us with their good ideas about how we can support evidence-based practices in schools. What I've seen since 2008 is an explosion in this work. We are attracting a lot of really talented researchers who have some really good ideas about how to improve these practices in school settings. But the flip side of this is, and I think this is what we're hearing here, it's also a need out there in the practice world, right? So teachers want this, they want support around this, schools are interested in this, and what's really interesting to me is to do good education research, you have to be in the schools doing your studies, doing your experiments, collecting data. That can be intrusive, that can be disruptive. I don't see the schools viewing this as disruptive or intrusive. They want to be part of this work. We're supporting a lot of research in this area, and so this kind of moment that I think the journal issue captures around the momentum, the excitement, the interest, the diverse perspectives, I'm seeing that at play in this smaller grant portfolio through IES. And I think this is it. I mean, I think we're at a really exciting time. We've taken stock, and now let's use the lever, right? Let's kind of get the ball rolling and do it in an organized way. So, Roger?
You have 8 minutes. She didn't use her whole time.
Yeah, I gave you a little extra there.
Because I need 15. No, my daytime job is I'm a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, but I've also been connected with CASEL for 23 years. I'm the chief knowledge officer of CASEL, and Tim and I have collaborated on a lot of things over decades. I'm always inspired by Tim, but I want to take exception to one thing he said. First of all, my wife and I have been married for 36 years. And we celebrated our anniversary on Sunday by going to Hamilton. So your first comment on Hamilton and not being important, you know, it's critically important.
And now you're in debt, right?
You're right. You're right. Recently, a lot of people have said to me, what's the reason for the growing interest in social and emotional learning? And I think about things in 3 ways. One is we really have a commitment to rigorous science and creating a scientific foundation for the field. Second, we care about evidence-based practice and policy. And we want to work towards constructive public policy. So in terms of this special issue, I really want to express to Stephanie and Emily my admiration. We don't have all the answers in the field, and one thing we always have to do is invite rigorous review, new thinking, and this special issue. I teach a course in social and emotional learning actually at the university. This will be one of the source documents where we will require students to read some of the work. So it's a very important contribution, and I appreciate being invited here to talk about Clark's policy piece. And Clark has already said it, but I'll offer a couple of comments about his 4 areas of a coordinated policy framework. One is, and I'm going to quote from his article, which I think is compelling and raises a lot of points. And I'm doing this because I agree with all of his recommendations in part 2. He said we should develop standards and implementation guidelines that specify the SEL skills children should know and be able to demonstrate and describe how to enhance those competencies. And I know that there's blowback about standards now, but I will say that 15 years ago when we brought together superintendents from across the country and said, how do we make SEL an essential part of education? They said you have to specify what children should know and be able to do to be able to demonstrate. And we work with collaborating districts. We work with 21 districts across the country now. Always there is some focus on kids' competencies, and they may stay away from standards now as a term, but they're talking about needing some direction, some specificity about what kids should know and be able to do. And all 50 states have preschool standards now in social and emotional development, and there are 7 states who have preschool through 3rd grade standards, and 4 states who have pre-K to 12 standards. So one of the things we need to do is look at standards frameworks that are being developed and have the best developmentalists, the best researchers, the best practitioners come together and do a good job in that area. Then Clark also says the best policies will give school districts incentives to adopt and rigorously implement effective SEL programs. Castle, we don't have our own program, but we do consumer report guides. We identify the best programs that are out there in terms of the research base, in terms of the implementation supports that are provided, in terms of the design of programs. So I offer that just as a service if we're going to support or incentivize, and we can think of different ways to do that, quality SEL programs. We need to find out which programs are out there. Clark emphasizes pre-service and in-service professional development. And Kim, who contributed a section to this issue, also has done a major national review of work in teacher and colleges of education. And then finally, he talks about research and development and identifies key areas, one being to create rigorous, scalable, useful SEL assessment systems. And we have a work group. Stephanie and Clark are both members of that work group, as well as other practitioners and researchers to advance work in this field. So Castle works on, in collaboration with the National Commission on Social and Emotional Development. We have a Collaborating States initiative. We're working now with 19 states on creating policies and supports for SEL. We work with 21 districts. We do program reviews, and we have this work group, assessment work group, as some of the things that we're involved with. We collaborate with John Bridgeland and the Civic Enterprises and Peter Hart Associates. There was a major report in 2013 where teachers said, we need to do this work. Tim referred to that. They're about to come out with a major report on administrators and principals' views, and principals are incredibly positive at seeing the importance of doing this work in their schools. There's no question that this is something that educators recognize the need for, but the question is, how do we do it well? I would say while Clark's recommendations are great, there are a couple of things that could have been done more. It won't be done necessarily in that paper, but for the field. At the federal level, ESSA is going on now, and we can talk about Title I, Title II, Title IV, Part A, career and technical education. There are reviews that have been done. RAND is about to come out with a review. Learning Policy Institutes came out with reviews thinking about links between ESSA and SEL programming, and I think that is something we have to think actively about. We've done, with Chris Ann Gale, a review of ESSA state plans and pointing out the way states can advance their plans to focus on social and emotional learning. We need training and technical assistance centers. Clark talked about teachers. Tim talked about superintendents. There's also need to work with boards of education and principals especially. So there is amazing interest in this work. There's great progress being made. If we want to educate kids who are knowledgeable, responsible, and caring, contributing citizens who are good family members, good workers, productive workers, good citizens, and academically successful, this needs to be a core part of education, and the question is how to do it well and advance the.
Great, thank you very much for that. In the policy brief, Clark said something that really got my attention as a former teacher and a person who's really interested in public education. He said that SEL is at a critical moment, and then he said either advances, or then he used a very technical term, fizzles. Fizzles. So if you're really confronted with fizzling, what are the steps you have to take to make sure that doesn't happen? We all know in education, it seems like there's a fad a month, and they come and go. So what can you do to make sure, what are the crucial steps that have to take place over, let's say, the next year or 5 years in order to make sure SEL continues to advance?
Well, I wouldn't use the term fizzle ever. I think that pendulums shift back and forth, and I
Sometimes they catch fire and fizzle, though.
you know, and sometimes when I was taught at Yale, Seymour Saracen I had a William T. Grant Faculty Scholar Award, and Seymour Saracen and I would go out to lunch. He was my mentor, and he said, there have been 8 million fads in the schools. What are you doing to have SEL not be 8 million and one?
I've never talked to the gentleman, sorry to say, but...
Yeah, and so this is an important question. I think the research base has to continue. I think we have to take on an attitude of continuous improvement. I think there needs to be connections with research practice and policy moving forward. I think assessment is critical. Clark makes very compelling cases for that all the time. But I think if I were to step back and say one thing about the principal report that's going to come out, everybody is supportive of SEL right now. The overwhelming majority of educators are. But there's a lot of different thoughts about what it is and how to do it well. And I think we have to, you think about something like Title II and professional learning for teachers, administrators, and other school leaders. Well, how do you make sure that colleges of education as well as in-service training is going to be done well so people can implement the programs effectively? Because ultimately the commitment to the field is going to happen when things are done in sensible ways and kids benefit and show growth, and we have to work to make that happen.
Stephanie.
So I have 1,000 things to say about everything that's been said. I'm gonna practice self-regulation, everybody. And
So you're going to cut it to 15 minutes, huh?
so I'm going to keep it to just the rest of the time we have today. I worry about the fizzle a great deal, and my graduate mentor was Ed Ziegler, who a good friend of Seymour Saracen, and he said to me repeatedly, Stephanie, watch out for the quick fix. Don't line up with the silver bullet mentality. And I think that this field can gravitate in that direction. And I think we really have to be wary and be careful and kind of return to core ideas, the core ideas that you laid out, and just be cautious, because the quick fix never works, right? It reveals itself time and time again as something that is not the answer, and that the work is hard, not impossible, but it takes time and commitment and effort. So beware the quick fix. And if you, again, spend a lot of time on Google, clearly if you Google social emotional learning, there's a lot out there that is not grounded in evidence, that is not linked to these kind of core ideas, and we should be cautious about that. So that's one thing I would say that is important in offsetting the fizzle. I think the other thing is complicated to do, and we're trying to do it, which is to really be clear about what we mean. What are we talking about about when we talk about social and emotional learning? How can we make sure that we are both inclusive and have lots of perspectives in the tent, but precise? What do we expect children to be able to do? And can we see it in their behavior? And if we get concrete about those things, then we can share the information with those who are working with kids and who can see it in their behavior. And it's it's not an easy project, but it's not impossible. I mean, state standard systems are those things, right? That's a version of that. So we have to be really clear and precise about what we mean. I think the other thing is it's kind of on the research side, it's kind of on the practice side, of course they go together, is to think about a new generation of approaches. And I'm really interested in what is common to effective programs. So there are lots of programs, and there have been lots of studies of them, and many of them are effective and fantastic. If you really look inside them, we have a form of a guide that builds on what Castle has done that does that, looks deep inside evidence-based programs, and say, what is common across these? Are those practices that we can integrate into through teacher preparation or other means into the fabric of schooling and therefore instantiate them in the place in a different way than tends to happen with a program, right? Which you say program and you think extra. You say strategy or practice, you think embedded and integrated. And I'm really curious about what those are and do they work when you try them on their own? So Turtle is a great example. Mm-hmm. That child in that example understood the idea. They didn't just understand the turtle concept, they understood what was inside of it. That's a core strategy. There are, 10 or 15 programs that have evidence behind them that have a version of that. The chili hug, the turtle, there's a whole bunch of them. And that's a common denominator of practice that one could spread. And because it might be simpler to enact, adaptable to local contexts, it might happen more and with more fidelity. So I'm really curious about this idea of integration and how we capitalize on what we've learned about programs to get to strategies.
Emily, you want to add anything?
I would just add the following. I mean, I don't think it's going to fizzle. We're not fizzling. I like the pendulum idea, and I do think that we kind of run the risk of we've hit this side of SEL. We don't want it to slip back. And I do feel that, to reiterate Stephanie's point, it's about the language. So what is the name? What is the it? Right? And I think the measurement piece, that's why I'm really glad we have the measurement paper as the policy paper here. I think that's the critical piece that's going to unite all of these different components in a meaningful way. So that's all I would add. I don't think we're going to fizzle, which I think is the good news. I think as we had said in the issue and introducing it, we wanted to take this moment to sort of put the stake in the ground and say, here's where we are. Here's what we're talking about, and now how do we move this forward? Because there's a lot out there, and I want to make sure we don't run that risk of kind of slipping back.
Clark.
As I was listening to my colleagues, I thought of Mad Men. Has anybody seen the series Mad Men?
Yes.
All right. I just started binge watching it, so most of my thoughts are influenced by Don Draper. But I will say that, if what we want to do is market an idea and create positive momentum behind it, I wonder if we are missing somebody at the table, which is, and I'm saying this not facetiously, somebody Don Draper-esque from an ad agency who could create the 30-second Super Bowl spot that would amplify our message. I know maybe that's a crazy idea, but we're not, like the future of children is not going to land at the breakfast table of every family in the United States. We speak well to some people, and other people go, what are you talking about? Mm-hmm. So how might we enlist communications experts to increase the ubiquity and positive feeling around this movement so that it can accelerate?
Okay, I would like to draw the panel's attention to a problem that I see. In other areas of social policy, teen pregnancy prevention, home visiting, employment training, the Obama administration set a clear path that I think is promising and may, in the long run, deliver. They require, to get federal grant money, that you be used in an evidence-based program, and they define it pretty precisely. And then they require continuous evaluation. This is a whole strategy of where we build this field by, you use the term, best programs that are presumably evidence-based, And you try to get people to use those as a way to make sure that they actually have impacts. Here's what we found in virtually every field. You can find evidence-based programs, and they are great. They really produce impacts. But then when you try to scale them up, and you have it at 5 places, or 100 places, or in many cases, if they're going to have a big impact in a country, 1,000 places, they don't work. They don't scale up very well. Are you afraid that that's going to happen in this field? And what would you do to prevent it?
Well, let me make it a little worse than you've just portrayed it. I think that, going back to the 70s, there was some work that says when you try to scale to new places, the programs don't seem to have as much impact. Or even if you stay in the same place over time with the churn, with the transitions, even in the same place where the program started, sometimes the impact can dissipate. So this is a big challenge for the field. I can say that the way that Castle has approached some of this, and we had an I3 grant to support some of this work too, is there needs to be systems level support, ongoing support for implementation in quality ways. So what's the school-wide perspective? What's the central office and district perspective? What's the state perspective? So with some of the scaling up, it's not just the program in isolation that needs to be going to a bunch of different sites. There's also this service delivery aspect of things, the systemic supports that need to be in place so that there is ongoing reflection and continuous improvement to programming over time. So this tends, I think, to be dynamic in how it needs to be approached and systemic rather than just thinking about, okay, so we have the program model and we'll try and get it in as many sites as possible.
Again, I have so many things to say about this. Just as a researcher, let's just be clear about what we mean by evidence-based programs, the things that end up on a list. It means it's been tried once, usually. So in one study, right? Because it could be tried in lots of places, but there's one study about it. And one of the core principles of the scientific enterprise is replication. So we haven't, on the research and development side, we haven't invested in replication to the degree that we should, certainly, so that we would know what it takes to do a particular program that is effective in my study in New York City, for example, to do it well in South Carolina, right, or Columbus or something like that. So we need to invest in building the evidence base in a different way. We can't, when we say evidence-based programs, we have to be really careful in defining what we're talking about. I think the second thing on the research agenda is there are few, if any, studies that say, okay, we know that this program as a block works. But what makes it work? What are the core mechanisms that account for the links we might see between some form of implementation and some set of outcomes? What's the core idea? And the core idea is what gets replicated, right? It's not necessarily the turtle, because the turtle might not make sense in every context. But the core idea behind the turtle is what accounts for the link between an implementation of something and an outcome we see. So that's what gets replicated. So a science of mechanism, a science of process is needed to be effective in the scaling enterprise. A third thing is, I think that we've spent a lot of time thinking through, scientists, the kind of core theories of change that underlie programs or approaches. They're preschool, elementary school, in all these settings. So we specify a really detailed theory of change, and then we use that as a guide to doing our one evaluation. And what we haven't really thought about, and this builds on Roger's point, is what's the theory of change for the scaling proposition? So let's take a particular program or approach. It's got, let's say, 2 studies. There are a few SEL interventions that have many studies behind them. So it's not that in this field, every approach has only 1 study. There are a few that have multiple studies. Caveat. But what's the scaling theory of action for a particular approach or set of approaches? What do we need to put in place and then understand and track to make sure that the scaling idea works? So I think there's more to be put into the endeavor before we can ask the question of whether or not scaling works or doesn't work. And that, I would say, is true for the vast majority of educational interventions. It's not just SEL. It's reading interventions, it's literacy interventions, it's math interventions. It's all of them.
I agree completely, and would just add and amplify a theme, which is, there's a whole field of implementation science. I'm not an implementation scientist, so I'm sure to butcher what it does, but I'm pretty sure implementation science is about how one takes effective programs and practices that have been demonstrated in a highly controlled, randomized controlled trial and scales them in other settings. What conditions need to be present? How do you promote those conditions so that when you spread the seeds, they actually take root? Right? I'm looking at my implementation scientist friend back there and hoping she's nodding yes. So that's part of the reason why in my remarks I thought at least some of the R&D support we ought to be focusing as the field moves forward is really the explicit study of implementation science and scaling. What conditions need to be present to support effective implementation of SEL programs at a broad scale, and how do we promote those conditions?
All right, audience. So this time, good questions, short from the audience, and short answers as possible from the panel so we can get to as many questions as possible. So someone come trotting up here, and on the right, two in, the lady with her hand up. Good, thank you.
Hi, I'm going to go for that 30-second ad. Let's see. Increasing social emotional learning decreases healthcare costs. I think one of the things that you all have not mentioned is health. Recently, I attended a showing of a movie called Resilience, which talks about the adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs, and how they impact someone's health. My name is Mindy. I have whatever you call it. It's called Qi for Health and Wellness. I'm a Qigong instructor. So when you talk about the turtle, that resonates with me. We need to be talking about health in all of this, because kids who don't know how to acknowledge their own feelings, how to recognize, where in my body do I feel angry? What does your face look like when it's angry? What does my face look like when it's angry? How do I let go of that anger in appropriate ways? We talk about adults, and the big variable about scaling these programs is the individual. I mean, a program can be really successful in Baltimore, Maryland, and take it to someplace else, and who's teaching that program? And are parents supporting or not supporting?
So let's go back to the panel now, because
Okay,
we're trying to get in a bunch of questions. So is she right? Should SEL apply to health? Go ahead.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would just want to say in the issue, especially the paper on the teachers piece really does highlight that point very nicely. And I think you're absolutely right that what we're talking about is when these sort of break down, these social skills and attitudes and the emotional understandings, that does have direct impacts on health and well-being.
Were you referring to a paper in the volume?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Which
yes.
one?
Oh, Kimberly Schoenert-Reichel's paper.
Okay, good, good. Okay, go
But
ahead.
there's also a kind of a new neuroscience of stress, the brain, and behavior that is informing practices in primarily what is described as sort of trauma-sensitive practices or trauma-sensitive learning. But it's really, if you look at it, it's very much the same as SEL. So absolutely, the links are there, the practices are similar, and we should make the case more explicitly. I agree.
That's a good
By the way, in a previous volume, we wrote a policy brief, Ross Thompson did, on stress, and it's what you just referred to as the new neurological science. And I think some of you might like it. It's on our website. It's the best short treatment. It's less than 3,000 words of what this is all about and what the science is behind it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I would just say I agree in principle, and I'm delighted that you took a crack at the 30-second Super Bowl slot. That's awesome. I want to hear everybody's ideas. But I would just say the one cautionary note I'd sound is if that's going to be our 30-second Super Bowl slot, let's make sure the evidence supports the idea that these programs and practices have health benefits. I think they probably do. They certainly have mental health benefits. But here's where, let's always have in the back of our minds not to overpromise.
But
Go ahead,
Well,
quickly.
The field of SEL began with problem prevention and things like substance abuse, and at a certain point people said, well, what are the common ingredients? And very often they were social and emotional competencies of kids. Mark Greenberg, one of the papers in the handbook talks about the public health approach to this work, and also Robert Wood Johnson is supporting a lot of work right now to create a culture of health, and we're trying to think through issues of how does social and emotional wellness fit into that culture of health. So I think there's a lot to be done in that area.
Next question. Come on up at front row here. Thank you.
Chris McRae, Union Baptist Church, Baltimore. So my question is about the marketing scaling of things, because if you look at, say, Development Goal 4 education, what you're talking about is almost the hottest topic bar none internationally, but they use a different language. So how do you connect 27 years of talking mainly to America, if I understand correctly, with this huge international demand?
Well, I don't know is really the answer, but I do know that, for example, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is seeking to follow a whole cohort of children around the world to understand, among other things, their social and emotional development and how it relates to their academic and life outcomes. They don't necessarily use the term social emotional learning, but clearly there's a common worldwide interest, and I think your question is mine. How do we link those efforts so that we're all singing from the same page, or at least communicating with one another?
So the OECD has a framework, like many of us do, and it aligns quite closely with the Castle framework, with other frameworks. And I think that they have actually begun to talk about social emotional learning as social emotional learning, social and emotional learning. So I think that there is more alignment going on than we might think. And there's sort of people here who are working on their various projects and back and forth.
I just wrote a foreword to a book called Social and Emotional Learning in Australia and the Asia Pacific, which will be coming out soon. And I also think that there's a lot of work now going on actually in Africa, Asia, India. I'm going to give a talk in Bangalore in July on it, and they call it social and emotional learning.
Also, states are like comprehensive curriculum on moral education. They use a more traditional term, but the underlying content is.
Actually, that was my main point. 4 big summits, the WISE summit, which is out of the UAE, the Education Commission, where Jack Ma came along and said what he wanted to invest in most of all was LQ, the quotient of love in education. But then he goes away because no one in America engages him on the spot with that. So you've got some of the answers, but the language doesn't match.
Yeah.
Next question. Right here on your left, right there. Right there. Stop. Give it that lady. Yes.
Quickly, for
What's
high
your name?
schools, are there programs that have been integrated into high schools and scaled up? And secondly, is there a way to do this incrementally, because oftentimes you can't get the support that you need to do it broadly?
You want to answer the high school question?
Well, I could say a couple of things. At a certain point, Castle, when we've done our reviews, separated out preschool, elementary, middle, and high school. The work at the high school is underdeveloped at this point, I think. There are programs in our guide like Expeditionary Learning, which is scaling up, and Facing History in Ourselves is a program that has scaled up a bit. Then there are approaches like project-based learning. Some of the work done in actually charter schools and private schools around the country have interesting high school models as well. But the work being done, I think, at high school is less well developed than with the younger kids.
One more question, all the way over here on the side.
My name is Sheldon Fishman. I'm a co-founder of Parents Coalition, and I have a nasty question. Are you concerned about snake oil salesmen in this industry, and in particular, national corporations getting $500,000 no-bid contracts in this area?
Good question.
Well, the answer is yes. One of the reasons that we do reviews of programs is to look at the evidence base about the program design, and early on, and I think it still exists, trying to introduce standards which actually have increased in rigor over the years as more work has been done in this field. Sometimes people get really mad at you when you do that, and we're trying to maintain the integrity at the highest level we can to advance the work with quality.
I share the concern about snake oil, and I don't know what the answer is. I think you out there in the audience know better how decisions get made by purchasers in school districts. I think we ought to consider co-opting strategies used by very successful and honorable education companies. Pearson is huge, and they're very successful at selling to school districts. And I don't think the purchasers are looking much at the evidence, though I think what they sell is probably very high quality. So how might we use those same strategies to get inroads to communicate what the evidence is that supports the programs that we're promoting, right? That we sell the evidence and the decision maker decides for themselves. So I think there's a lot to be learned from not snake oil salesmen, but from the private sector about how to engage with school districts to sell what's important to us, which I think is evidence-based programs that are really going to move the needle for kids.
So, what a great event. We had wonderful people. It's a good journal. If you read it, I think you really learn something. And we have a huge audience here. It's very nice to see such a big audience. And we also have an even bigger audience. I think the biggest one we've ever had for any event at my center, sponsored on the web. So please join me in thanking the panel and come back soon.